Every journey holds the potential for unexpected encounters, some simple, others life-changing. When Victoria James, a renowned civil rights attorney with a quiet but commanding presence, boards a routine flight from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., she isn't looking for attention. Dressed in modest attire, she seeks only peace after weeks of tireless advocacy work. But in the polished world of first class, where appearances often speak louder than words, assumptions can be dangerous. Rebecca Collins, the lead flight attendant, prides herself on running a flawless cabin. Yet when she notices Victoria's understated appearance, her instincts, clouded by bias, lead her to question whether Victoria belongs in her seat. What begins as a quiet inquiry soon spirals into a moment of self-reckoning for Rebecca, for the passengers watching, and even for Victoria herself. As calm composure meets prideful doubt, the question remains, how will this story unfold when assumptions are confronted and humility is tested at 35,000 feet? Victoria James adjusted the strap of her leather satchel as she made her way through the bustling LAX terminal. The overhead announcements competed with the hum of voices, footsteps tapping across sleek floors, and the occasional ring of cell phones. In her comfortable flats, navy blue sweater and dark jeans, Victoria blended into the sea of travelers, rushing from one gate to another. Her flight to Washington, D.C. was scheduled for noon. For once, Victoria allowed herself to savor the simplicity of being anonymous. After weeks of back-to-back legal meetings advocating for marginalized communities, she had chosen to fly commercial instead of taking a corporate-sponsored jet. She needed the quiet reminder of what she was fighting for, a connection to the people whose lives inspired her work. Her mind drifted as she watched families hurry past. An elderly couple held hands, their slow steps in sync. A young father struggled with two toddlers as they giggled and ran in opposite directions. Victoria smiled softly, savoring the ordinary scenes that grounded her. The first-class cabin felt smaller than she expected, yet it exuded understated luxury. The seats were wide, the legroom generous, and the flight attendants were polished and efficient. Victoria took her window seat in the second row and slid her carry-on into the overhead compartment. She lowered herself into the plush seat, exhaling slowly as a calm silence washed over her. She reached into her bag, pulling out a worn hardcover, a biography of the late civil rights leader Barbara Jordan. The weight of the book felt familiar in her hands, a small anchor amidst the chaos of life. The hum of passengers boarding behind her became a dull background as she opened the book and began to read. Rebecca Collins, the lead flight attendant, stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, her sharp eyes scanning the cabin. Rebecca had a reputation for running an impeccable first-class experience, every detail polished, every passenger respected, but held to her standards of decorum. As she made her way down the aisle, she noticed the woman in seat 2A. Rebecca's gaze lingered on Victoria's simple attire, a navy sweater, plain jeans, no designer handbag in sight. Her brow furrowed. Most of the passengers in first class wore tailored suits or luxury accessories, broadcasting their success. Yet this woman exuded quiet confidence despite her modest appearance. Rebecca's instincts whispered a warning. In her 15 years of experience, she had encountered imposters, people who charmed their way into premium seating without the proper boarding pass. The memory of a past mistake resurfaced, a stinging reminder of how her team had been reprimanded for allowing an unauthorized passenger into first class. Her grip tightened on the clipboard as she approached seat 2A with a composed smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am," she began, her voice practiced but tinged with scrutiny. "May I see your ticket again, please?" Victoria looked up slowly, her calm brown eyes meeting Rebecca's blue gaze. There was no irritation in her expression, only quiet curiosity. Without a word, Victoria reached into her bag and handed over her neatly folded boarding pass. Rebecca scanned the ticket, her eyes tracing each detail. Everything matched perfectly. Seat 2A, first class, Confirmed. Yet Rebecca hesitated, an irrational sense of unease lingering in her mind. She returned the ticket and offered a tight smile. "Thank you, ma'am." Victoria took the ticket back with grace, tucking it into her bag. She returned to her book, seemingly unaffected by the exchange. But Rebecca lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary, studying Victoria's composed posture and serene expression. As Rebecca walked back toward the galley, another flight attendant, Emma Foster, intercepted her with a curious glance. Emma was younger, with an easy smile and a knack for diffusing tension. She noticed Rebecca's unsettled demeanor and whispered, "Is something wrong?" Rebecca hesitated before answering. "That woman in 2A? I don't know. She doesn't look like she belongs here." Emma frowned. "But her ticket is valid, right?" Rebecca nodded but crossed her arms. "It is, but experience teaches you to trust your instincts. I just want to be sure." Emma's brow furrowed as she glanced toward Victoria. "Maybe she's just someone who prefers simplicity." Rebecca didn't reply. Her pride resisted the idea of letting go of her suspicions. She wasn't trying to be unkind. She was trying to uphold the standards that defined her job. But doubt had already planted itself in her mind. Victoria, meanwhile, remained engrossed in her book. She noticed the whispers, the subtle sideways glances from the flight attendants, and the wary silence hanging in the air. Her shoulders relaxed, but her heart felt a familiar heaviness. She had spent a lifetime navigating spaces where she was subtly, and sometimes overtly, doubted. From her first days in law school to boardrooms full of powerful executives, Victoria had learned to carry herself with resilience. It was not pride, it was survival. A young man seated across the aisle from her, dressed in a tailored suit and scrolling through his phone, suddenly paused. He squinted at Victoria, recognition flickering in his eyes. Leaning toward his companion, he whispered, "She looks familiar. Is she someone important?" The companion shrugged but cast another glance at Victoria, curiosity piqued. Rebecca, still watching from afar, noticed the exchange and felt her pulse quicken. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't hostility, it was the need to ensure perfection. But she failed to notice the quiet resilience radiating from the woman in seat 2A. Victoria turned a page in her book, absorbing the words of a leader who had faced adversity with unwavering courage. Her reflection stared back at her from the window, a woman who had built her life on the belief that progress came not from proving her worth, but from holding fast to her dignity. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the tension simmered beneath the polished surface of the first-class cabin. Rebecca smoothed the hem of her uniform and took a deep breath. She was determined to uphold her responsibilities. With one last glance toward Victoria, Rebecca whispered under her breath, "I'm still not convinced." Victoria, though she appeared at ease, felt the weight of assumptions pressing down. But she remained steady, her strength resting not in outward displays, but in quiet perseverance. The wheels of the plane began to lift from the ground, carrying all of their unspoken stories into the sky. The plane ascended smoothly, the hum of the engines filling the cabin with a steady rhythm. Victoria James kept her eyes on the pages of her book, but her mind wandered. Despite her calm exterior, she was keenly aware of the tension around her, the cautious glances, the lingering questions, the weight of silent assumptions pressing down. Her grip on the hardcover tightened for a moment before she took a breath and loosened her fingers. She had not come this far in life to be shaken by suspicion. Rebecca Collins moved down the aisle with a forced smile, checking that passengers had their seatbelts fastened and their trays secured. She felt the familiar hum of responsibility, but today it was clouded by something more, a gnawing unease she couldn't explain. As she passed Victoria's row, her eyes drifted to the woman again. Victoria had returned to reading, her expression composed. A pang of doubt flickered in Rebecca's chest, but it was overshadowed by her determination to be thorough. She paused for a second longer than necessary, as though expecting to see something out of place. But everything was perfectly normal too. Normal, in fact. Rebecca turned away, but didn't walk far. In the galley at the front of the plane, Emma Foster was preparing the first round of drinks for the passengers. She glanced up as Rebecca stepped in, her movements a little too stiff. "Still thinking about seat 2A?" Emma asked, her voice light, but her eyes serious. Rebecca let out a soft sigh and leaned against the counter. "I don't know what it is, Emma. She has a first-class ticket, and everything checks out, but she doesn't fit." Emma stopped stirring the lemon slices in the pitcher of water. "Doesn't fit what? The image in your mind?" Rebecca hesitated. Emma's question lingered in the air, like a soft echo that refused to fade. Rebecca wasn't used to being questioned herself. She was the one who kept everything in order. "I just want to make sure everything is right. You know how it goes. We can't afford any slip-ups." Emma nodded slowly, but her gaze softened. "I get it, Rebecca. We've both seen people sneak into first class before. But sometimes, maybe it's not about them. Maybe it's about what we think when we look at them." Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but shut it again, unsure of what to say. Instead, she grabbed a bottle of sparkling water and handed it to Emma. "Let's just focus on getting through the service." Emma watched her for a moment before returning to the drinks, but her words stayed with Rebecca. In her seat, Victoria turned another page. Though she'd read the same sentence 3 times now, she could feel the shift in the cabin, the subtle change in energy when people became curious. A quiet conversation a few rows behind caught her attention. The young man in the tailored suit leaned toward his travel companion again. "I swear I know her from somewhere. I think she's been on the news." His companion, an older woman in a gray blazer, adjusted her glasses and gave Victoria a thoughtful look. "She has that presence, doesn't she? Calm but important." The young man nodded. "Exactly. She doesn't seem like she's trying to prove anything. She just is." Victoria pretended not to notice, but inwardly, a familiar weariness settled in. She'd heard those whispers before, the puzzled curiosity, the recognition that came only after someone realized who she was. For years, Victoria had fought not only for justice in the courtroom, but for the simple right to exist in spaces where she was often underestimated. She had learned long ago that silence could be a shield, but also a quiet form of strength. Rebecca walked back down the aisle with the drink cart, her practiced smile back in place. When she reached Victoria's row, she hesitated before asking, "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" Victoria looked up, offering a polite smile. "Just water, please." Rebecca poured the water into a glass and handed it over, her fingers brushing the edge slightly. She was startled by how steady Victoria's gaze was, not confrontational, not defensive, but deeply aware. Victoria took a sip and set the glass down gently on the tray. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. Rebecca blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Of course, ma'am. If you need anything else, please let me know." Victoria nodded and returned to her book, but she felt the question settle in the air between them. As Rebecca reached the galley again, Emma was wiping down the counter. "That woman is cool as a cucumber," Emma remarked. "She didn't even flinch when you asked her again." Rebecca sighed, a small knot tightening in her chest. "I know. That's what's so strange. Most people would look annoyed, embarrassed, or defensive. But she didn't." Emma gave her a curious look. Maybe she didn't because she's done nothing wrong. Maybe she's used to being questioned and has learned to stay calm. Rebecca frowned but didn't argue. She thought of how many passengers in first class flaunted their importance, making demands as soon as they sat down. But the woman in seat 2A wasn't like that. Her quiet presence unsettled Rebecca more than it should have. Victoria's thoughts drifted as she closed her book for a moment. The memory of her first day in law school surfaced, walking into a classroom filled with students from wealthy families. Her second-hand textbooks clutched to her chest. She had felt the weight of their assumptions from the start, but she had risen above them, not by shouting louder, but by excelling on her own terms. She opened her eyes and caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. She was still that girl in some ways, resilient, determined, and unshaken by doubt. But that strength had come at a cost. The plane leveled out, the captain's voice announcing their cruising altitude. Passengers settled in, but the tension in first class lingered, unspoken, yet palpable. Rebecca stole another glance at Victoria and whispered under her breath, "I'm still not convinced." Her words were soft, but they carried the weight of her own doubts about Victoria and perhaps about herself. Victoria, though outwardly calm, could feel the storm building beneath the surface. But she knew storms well. They only made the sky clearer when they passed. The plane glided steadily at cruising altitude, sunlight streaming through the small windows and casting warm patches of light on the cabin walls. Most of the passengers were settling into their books, music, or quiet conversations, but the tension around Seat 2A persisted like an unspoken whisper. Victoria James resumed her reading, but the words blurred as she felt the weight of curiosity pressing in from all directions. She knew this feeling too well, the silent question that echoed in people's eyes. Who is she? At the front of the cabin, Rebecca Collins stood near the intercom, staring absently at the flight manifest. Her fingers drummed lightly against the edge of the clipboard. She felt Emma's watchful gaze but kept her focus forward. Finally, Rebecca decided. She walked to the small door of the cockpit and knocked lightly before stepping in. Captain Jason Roberts, a composed man with silver hair and an air of calm authority, turned his chair slightly to face her. "Everything all right, Rebecca?" he asked, his tone professional but warm. Rebecca hesitated for half a second before answering. "There's a passenger in Seat 2A. I'm not sure she belongs there." Jason arched an eyebrow. "Is her ticket valid?" "Yes," Rebecca admitted, her cheeks warming slightly. "It's valid, but something feels off." Jason studied her carefully. "Rebecca, I've known you long enough to understand that you take your job seriously, but we cannot afford to let assumptions cloud our judgment." Rebecca's shoulders tensed. She had expected his response, but the words still hit harder than she liked. "I know, I don't want to make a mistake, Captain." Jason nodded, but there was a faint edge in his voice now. "Then make sure it's not the kind of mistake that comes from doubting someone because of how they look. Trust me, it's not worth it." Rebecca swallowed hard and nodded. She backed out of the cockpit and returned to the cabin, her mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. She told herself she was only doing her job, ensuring that every detail was in place. But another voice, the one she rarely let herself hear, whispered that maybe she was afraid of being wrong. Victoria closed her book, deciding she needed a moment to clear her thoughts. She reached into her bag for a bottle of water and took a slow sip. The cold liquid calmed her, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that she was being watched. Sure enough, Rebecca reappeared beside her, her polite smile in place, but her eyes scanning Victoria's face for some answer that wasn't there. "Excuse me, ma'am," Rebecca began, her tone still professional but firmer now. "I hope I'm not troubling you, but I'd like to verify your identity for security purposes." The hum of the cabin seemed to quiet, as if the air itself had gone still. A few passengers glanced up from their magazines and tablets, sensing that something unusual was happening. Victoria set her water bottle down slowly and folded her hands in her lap. Her heart beat steadily, but inside, she felt the familiar sting of being questioned yet again. She met Rebecca's gaze calmly and asked, "Is there a reason you're singling me out?" Rebecca's breath caught at the quiet strength behind the question. There was no accusation in Victoria's tone, only a gentle but unwavering demand for truth. "I?" Rebecca faltered, searching for a reason that didn't sound hollow. Her professionalism warred with her pride. We've had incidents in the past where unauthorized passengers have made their way into first class. I'm just trying to ensure everything is in order." Victoria tilted her head slightly, her eyes unblinking. "If I need to leave, just say the word," she said, her voice steady and calm. "But ask yourself, why me?" The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a long moment, Rebecca was speechless. 2 rows back, a man in his mid-40s leaned over to his travel companion and muttered, "People should know their place." His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to make heads turn. A woman across the aisle, a middle-aged executive with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, shot the man a cold glare. "That's enough," she said, her voice sharp but measured. The man shrank slightly in his seat, his smug expression slipping. Meanwhile, Victoria remained composed, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't new to moments like this. She had faced far worse in courtrooms where her intelligence and credibility were questioned simply because of who she was and how she looked. But this moment still stung, not because she was surprised, but because she wasn't. Rebecca took a small step back, realizing how closely the other passengers were watching. The weight of their silent judgment bore down on her. A man in a tailored suit a few seats back leaned toward his wife and whispered, "She's handling this with so much grace. It's impressive." His wife nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "She doesn't look angry, just disappointed." Rebecca felt that disappointment like a blade. For the first time, she wondered if she had let her instincts become something more dangerous, a bias she didn't want to admit to herself. The hum of the plane returned as passengers resumed their quiet conversations, though the undercurrent of tension remained. Victoria reached for her book again, but she didn't open it. Instead, she let her mind drift back to memories of her first major case, the nights she spent poring over documents, the moments when she was the only woman of color in the room, and the times when her every word had been doubted until she proved herself beyond any doubt. She had won that case, not with force, but with clarity and resilience. She had learned that dignity often spoke louder than words. Rebecca stood by the galley, replaying Victoria's words in her mind. "Why me?" the question echoed, demanding an answer she wasn't ready to face. Emma glanced over, concern softening her features. "You okay?" Emma asked gently. Rebecca didn't respond at first. Then she exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of her neck. "I think I've made a mistake." Emma set down the glass she was holding and took a step closer. "Everyone makes mistakes, Rebecca. What matters is what you do next." Rebecca nodded, but the weight of the moment still pressed down on her shoulders. She turned to look at Victoria again, at her calmness, her quiet dignity, and for the first time, Rebecca felt something other than suspicion. She felt regret. The first-class cabin had settled, but the echoes of what had happened still lingered in the air, like a song that refused to end. Conversations resumed at a low hum, and the occasional clink of glasses could be heard as flight attendants moved through the aisles. But beneath the surface, everyone was still processing the quiet storm that had passed. Victoria James turned another page in her book, but her mind wandered to memories of moments she had tried to leave behind. The sting of being underestimated, the looks that spoke volumes without words, and the countless times she had been asked to prove she belonged somewhere. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her place. It might not even be the last, but she had long since learned to rise above those doubts. In the galley, Rebecca Collins leaned against the counter, staring blankly at the stack of neatly folded napkins. Emma watched her carefully, unsure whether to speak. Rebecca's usual confidence had melted away, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than words. Finally, Rebecca broke the stillness. "I keep replaying it in my head," she murmured. "I can't believe I did that." Emma placed a hand on Rebecca's arm, her voice gentle. "You're not the first person to make a mistake, Rebecca." Rebecca shook her head. "But this wasn't just any mistake. I didn't doubt her because of anything she said or did. I doubted her because of how she looked. She let out a shaky breath, her eyes glistening. I've always told myself that I'm fair, that I treat everyone equally. But today, I wasn't. Emma didn't offer hollow reassurances. She knew Rebecca needed to sit with the truth of what had happened. We all have blind spots, she said instead. The important thing is what you do with what you've learned. Rebecca nodded but felt a pang in her chest. The words were comforting, but they didn't erase the weight of her actions. Back in her seat, Victoria closed her book, letting the silence settle around her. Her thoughts drifted to the past, to her childhood in Georgia, where the summers were hot and the afternoons were filled with the sounds of cicadas. She remembered sitting on the porch with her grandmother, who had lived through the civil rights era with quiet dignity and unshakable faith. "People will try to tell you who you are," her grandmother had once said, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "But you get to decide what you believe. And when you know your worth, you don't need to shout it, you live it." Those words had shaped Victoria's life. They had carried her through law school, where she was one of the few black women in her class, and through her early years as an attorney, when her competence was often questioned before she even spoke. A few rows back, a businessman with silver-framed glasses leaned toward the woman next to him. "She's incredible," he whispered. "I can't believe how calm she was. If it had been me, I'd have lost my temper." The woman, a novelist who had been watching closely, nodded. "That's the thing about true strength, it's quiet. It doesn't need to prove itself." The businessman frowned, his brows knit in thought. "Makes you wonder how often someone like her has to go through this." The novelist sighed softly. "Probably more than we realize." Rebecca pressed her palms against the counter and exhaled slowly. "I need to apologize again," she said aloud. Emma tilted her head. "You already apologized." Rebecca shook her head. "Not enough. I need her to know that I'm not just sorry, I'm going to be better." Emma stepped aside as Rebecca grabbed a fresh glass and filled it with water. Her hands trembled slightly, but her resolve was steady. She straightened her uniform and walked purposefully back into the cabin. Victoria glanced up as Rebecca stopped beside her seat. There was no fear or irritation in Victoria's expression, only quiet curiosity. Rebecca cleared her throat. "Ms. James," she began, her voice softer than before, I know I already apologized, but I need you to know that I'm truly sorry, not just for the way I treated you, but for what it says about me. You deserved better than that." Victoria set her book aside and folded her hands on her lap. "Why do you think you reacted the way you did?" she asked, her voice free of judgment. Rebecca blinked, caught off guard by the question. She expected an acknowledgement, maybe even forgiveness, but not an invitation to reflect. I guess I've always trusted my instincts," Rebecca admitted. "And sometimes I let those instincts become assumptions." Her voice grew quieter. "I think I was afraid of being wrong." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. "That's a common fear, but sometimes our fear of being wrong can lead us to make even bigger mistakes." Rebecca felt those words settle deep in her chest. She had spent years perfecting every detail of her service, but in her pursuit of perfection, she had overlooked the importance of humility. Victoria's expression softened. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, and it takes even more courage to grow from it." Rebecca's breath caught, and for the first time that day, she felt something shift inside her, a sense of clarity that replaced the storm of shame. Across the aisle, a young man in a hoodie and headphones had been quietly observing the interaction. He lowered his music and leaned over to the older woman seated next to him. "She could have humiliated that flight attendant," he whispered. "But she didn't." The woman smiled gently. "That's what grace looks like." As Rebecca turned to walk back to the galley, she felt lighter, not because the mistake had vanished, but because she had taken the first real step toward accountability. Victoria watched her retreat, and then returned to her book, though the words held a deeper meaning now. She hadn't intended to become a symbol or a lesson, but she understood that moments like these had the power to change people. She thought again of her grandmother's words, "You live your worth, and the world will catch on eventually." In the quiet hum of the cabin, Victoria took another sip of water and allowed herself a small, private smile. She had come through many storms in her life, and this one, though unexpected, was just another reminder of how far she had come. Rebecca, back in the galley, stood a little taller as she resumed her duties. The journey wasn't over, but she felt the first flicker of hope. She would be better not just for Victoria, but for herself. The plane soared forward, carrying with it stories of mistakes, reflections, and the quiet hope that people could grow beyond their worst moments. The cabin was quiet, save for the faint hum of the engines and the occasional murmur of conversation. The incident that had unfolded earlier still lingered in the atmosphere, yet there was a noticeable shift, something softer, almost reflective, in the way people glanced at one another. Rebecca Collins stood in the galley, her thoughts spinning as she mechanically refilled glasses of sparkling water. The hum of the service routine usually comforted her, but now it only reminded her of what had happened. She glanced at the empty tray in front of her and let out a slow breath. Emma stepped up beside her, folding a napkin neatly into a triangle. "You okay?" she asked quietly, though her kind eyes had already guessed the answer. Rebecca gave a small nod. "I think I'm finally starting to be." Emma studied her for a moment, then asked, "So, what's next?" Rebecca wiped her palms on her apron. "I need to make things right." Victoria James had set her book aside and was staring out the window, watching the clouds drift beneath the plane. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, a calm, composed face, but behind it, layers of memories. She thought about all the years she'd worked so hard to overcome doubt, not just the doubt of others, but sometimes her own. She remembered her first trial, fresh out of law school. The opposing lawyer had condescended to her during opening arguments, subtly implying that she was too young, too inexperienced to handle a case of such magnitude. But she hadn't wavered. Instead, she'd let her work speak louder than his words. That had been the case that launched her career. But more than that, it had taught her that resilience wasn't always loud. It was steady, deliberate, and rooted in self-respect. Her thoughts drifted back to the present as Rebecca stepped into the aisle and made her way toward seat 2A. Victoria noticed her approaching, but didn't move, waiting with the quiet patience of someone who understood the power of stillness. Rebecca stopped beside her, holding a glass of water as if it were a peace offering. Her expression was sincere, vulnerable in a way Victoria hadn't seen before. "Ms. James," Rebecca began softly, "I know I've already apologized, but I need to say this properly." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I was wrong, not just in how I treated you, but in what it said about me. I assumed things I had no right to assume. And I know saying I'm sorry isn't enough, but I want you to know that I'm going to do better." Victoria's gaze softened, though her poise remained. She gestured for Rebecca to sit in the empty seat across the aisle. Rebecca hesitated but obliged, folding her hands in her lap like a schoolgirl awaiting judgment. Victoria tilted her head slightly. "Why do you want to do better?" Rebecca blinked at the question. "Because it's the right thing to do." Victoria nodded but didn't break eye contact. "It is, but what's the real reason?" Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, then spoke, her voice low. "I've spent years believing I was fair, treating every passenger the same. But today, I saw myself clearly, and I didn't like who I saw." Victoria leaned forward slightly, her voice warm but resolute. "You've taken the first step, Rebecca. Acknowledging where you went wrong is important. But the real work is in what comes next, How you change, how you treat people going forward, even when no one's watching. Rebecca felt her chest tighten with emotion, but it wasn't just shame. It was something else. Something like hope. "I promise I will," Rebecca said quietly. Victoria studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "Then that's a good start." Across the cabin, passengers watched the interaction with quiet admiration. The young tech executive who had been whispering earlier leaned over to his colleague again. "That's impressive," he said, his tone more thoughtful now. His colleague nodded. "Yeah, you don't see grace like that every day from either of them." The novelist across the aisle smiled faintly as she sipped her wine. "We could all learn something from that." Rebecca rose from the seat, feeling lighter but still humbled. She returned to the galley, where Emma was waiting with a gentle smile. "How did it go?" Emma asked. Rebecca exhaled, a small, genuine smile forming. "Better than I expected." Emma gave her a playful nudge. "See? It's not the end of the world." Rebecca laughed softly, the sound easing some of the tension in her chest. "No," she agreed, "but it's definitely a new beginning." Victoria returned to her seat and resumed reading her book, but she felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. She didn't relish moments like these being someone's lesson or catalyst for growth, but she understood that change often began in unexpected ways. She thought of her grandmother's advice once more. "You don't change people by shouting, you change them by showing them a better way." A few rows back, the businessman with the silver-framed glasses reached for his notepad and scribbled a quick note. "True power doesn't demand respect. It earns it through integrity," the novelist noticed and smiled. "That'll make a good story one day," she remarked. The businessman chuckled. "It already is." As the hours passed and the plane continued its journey, the first-class cabin settled into a quieter rhythm. The incident that had threatened to fracture the flight had instead become a reminder, a quiet lesson in humility, respect, and the possibility of change. Rebecca continued her duties with a renewed focus. She approached each passenger with sincerity, her usual efficiency softened by something new: kindness, born from self-awareness. When she refilled a glass or adjusted a blanket, she met each passenger's eyes, ensuring they felt seen, not just served. Victoria watched this transformation from the corner of her eye. She didn't need further apologies or gestures. Rebecca's actions were proof enough. As the sun began to set outside the windows, casting the cabin in a soft golden glow, Victoria let herself relax fully for the first time since the plane had taken off. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engines soothe her. Rebecca, standing near the galley, glanced toward seat 2A one last time. When she saw the peaceful expression on Victoria's face, she knew that she had taken the first step not just toward earning someone else's respect, but toward respecting herself again. By the time the captain announced they had begun their descent, there was a quiet understanding in the cabin. The passengers who had witnessed everything wouldn't soon forget it, not because of scandal or spectacle, but because they had seen something rare: the quiet power of humility, grace, and second chances. As the plane dipped lower toward the lights of Washington, D.C., a sense of renewal filled the space. Rebecca felt it. So did Emma. And so, too, did Victoria, who knew that this moment wasn't just about what had happened on this flight, it was about what could happen next. The plane descended steadily, the landscape below coming into view, a patchwork of cities, rivers, and highways glowing in the fading light of early evening. The flight had only a short time left, but the atmosphere in the first-class cabin was markedly different. Gone was the uneasy tension that had hung in the air like an unspoken question. Instead, there was a sense of quiet reflection. Victoria James sat back in her seat, her book resting on her lap, though she wasn't reading. Her thoughts were still on the conversation she'd had with Rebecca Collins. There was something profound about watching someone realize their mistakes and resolve to change. Victoria had seen it happen in courtrooms, in boardrooms, and now on a plane at 35,000 feet. Rebecca, meanwhile, was back at the galley, wiping down counters with steady hands. The knot of tension in her chest had loosened, but she still felt the weight of her resolve to not let her promises to Victoria or to herself fall away with time. She turned as Emma came in, carrying a tray of empty glasses. "You seem different," Emma said with a small smile. "In a good way." Rebecca gave a quiet nod. "I feel different. I don't know how to explain it, but something shifted." She paused, then added, "I've spent so long thinking that being the best meant never making mistakes. But now I think maybe it's about how you handle them when they happen." Emma nodded thoughtfully, placing the glasses in the sink. "You're right. You can't control everything, but you can choose who you want to be afterward." Rebecca gave a small smile in return. "Thanks, Emma. You've been a good friend today." Emma waved a hand dismissively, but looked pleased. It's easy to be a good friend when you're ready to listen. As Rebecca re-entered the cabin, she noticed something she hadn't before. How many passengers were watching Victoria, not out of curiosity anymore, but with something closer to admiration. The novelist in the corner had stopped typing and was gazing at Victoria with a contemplative expression. The businessman with the silver glasses was making notes in the margins of a leather-bound journal. The young tech executive seated nearby leaned over to his travel companion again. "You know, I was wrong earlier," he admitted. "I thought she didn't belong here, but she's probably the most composed person I've ever seen." His companion smiled. "It's funny how someone's presence can change a whole space. She didn't even have to raise her voice." Rebecca continued down the aisle, stopping to offer a glass of water to an elderly woman sitting quietly with her hands folded. The woman smiled and shook her head. "No, thank you, dear. I'm fine." Rebecca hesitated, feeling an inexplicable urge to share her thoughts. "Is there something on your mind, ma'am?" she asked gently. The woman smiled kindly. "Just thinking how much we can learn from watching others. That woman in 2A, she didn't let the situation break her. She's stronger than most people I know." Rebecca nodded slowly. "She is." The elderly woman tilted her head. "But you know what else? It takes strength to admit when you're wrong and try to make things right." Rebecca's breath caught for a moment before she smiled. "Thank you for saying that." Victoria, still gazing out the window, noticed the subtle shift in the cabin. She felt the change without needing to hear the conversations. Moments like this where people pause long enough to examine their own thoughts were rare. They reminded her of the quieter victories in her life, the ones that didn't make headlines but still felt just as significant. She remembered a mentor once telling her, "You won't always know the lives you touch or the impact you leave behind, but trust that it's there." She turned slightly as a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, Ms. James?" Victoria looked up to see the young man in the hoodie standing in the aisle, his headphones resting around his neck. His hands were stuffed awkwardly into his pockets, and he looked slightly nervous. I just wanted to say something," he began. He shifted his weight as though searching for the right words. "I watched what happened earlier, and I just wanted you to know, I think it was amazing how calm you stayed. Most people would have gotten angry or defensive, but you handled it with grace." Victoria smiled gently. "Thank you. That means a lot." The young man gave a small nod. "I've been in situations where people assume things about me because of how I look, and I don't always handle it well. But seeing you today, it makes me want to do better." Victoria's heart swelled with quiet pride, not for herself, but for him. "It's not always easy," she said, "but if you remember who you are, you'll be surprised how strong you can be." The young man nodded again, his shoulders a little straighter now. "Thanks. I won't forget that." He returned to his seat, and Victoria watched him for a moment before turning back to the window. Rebecca stood near the front of the cabin, watching the exchange. She felt something stir in her chest, a mixture of hope and humility. One act of grace had rippled outward, changing more than just her own perspective. As she reached for another tray of glasses, she noticed the businessman with the silver glasses approach Victoria's seat. He cleared his throat politely. "Ms. James, I just wanted to say thank you," he said, "for how you handled everything today. It's given me a lot to think about." Victoria smiled, a quiet warmth in her eyes. "I'm glad." The businessman hesitated, then added, "I run a company, and I think I need to re-examine some things: how I lead, how I treat people. You reminded me of what really matters." Victoria nodded. "Leadership starts with respect." He smiled and returned to his seat, scribbling something else into his journal. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing the plane's descent into Washington, D.C. The passengers began adjusting their seats and gathering their belongings. But there was something different about the way they moved, a quiet reverence for the moment they had all shared. Rebecca moved down the aisle one last time, her gaze briefly meeting Victoria's. Victoria offered a small nod, one that spoke of mutual understanding. Emma joined Rebecca at the front as they prepared for landing. "You did good," Emma said softly. Rebecca exhaled, a small but genuine smile forming on her face. "Thanks." As the plane dipped below the clouds, the lights of the city came into view, casting a warm glow over the horizon. Victoria leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment and letting the hum of the engines lull her into a peaceful state. She didn't need anyone's recognition or applause. The quiet conversations she'd overheard, the glances filled with newfound respect, those were enough. She had lived her truth, and that truth had spoken louder than words. Rebecca, standing at the front of the cabin, watched the passengers with a renewed sense of purpose. Today had been hard, but it had taught her something she would carry for the rest of her life. Respect, empathy, and grace weren't just part of the job, they were what defined it. The plane prepared to touch down, and the cabin felt lighter, as though every person on board had gained something they hadn't expected. The belief that people could change, and that one act of kindness could ripple far beyond the moment. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, the wheels rolling across the runway as the cabin swayed slightly. A few passengers glanced out the windows as the runway lights zipped by, their reflections glimmering in the glass. The familiar ding of the seatbelt sign signaled the official end of the flight. Victoria James leaned back briefly before gathering her things. She took her time, not wanting to rush through the final moments of the journey. This flight had turned into something more than a trip across the country. It had been a quiet reminder of resilience, self-awareness, and grace. Rebecca Collins stood by the exit, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Though her posture was professional, her heart raced with anticipation. She had promised herself that this moment wouldn't pass without a final acknowledgement, a small gesture to show that she understood what had happened, and that she would remember it long after the flight ended. The passengers began to rise, gathering their carry-ons and stepping into the aisle. There was the usual shuffle of movement as they filed toward the exit, but the whispers that had buzzed earlier were gone. Instead, there was a calmness, a silent respect. Victoria placed her book in her bag, adjusted her satchel, and stood, smoothing the front of her sweater. She made her way to the front of the cabin, offering polite smiles to a few passengers who nodded at her as she passed. The young man with the hoodie gave her a small thumbs up. She returned it with a subtle nod, her expression warm but composed. The businessman with the silver glasses inclined his head respectfully, and the novelist mouthed, "Thank you," as if they were old friends who'd shared a secret. As Victoria reached the front of the cabin, Rebecca took a step forward. Her heart felt full not with guilt anymore, but with a strange kind of hope, like she'd been given a chance to start over. "Ms. James," Rebecca began, her voice soft but steady, "thank you for your patience today." She paused briefly, and then, with genuine sincerity, added, "I want you to know that I meant what I said. I will do better." Victoria looked at her, and for a moment, the noise of passengers around them seemed to fade. Her gaze was kind, but resolute. "We're all learning," Victoria said gently. "The real test is what we do with what we've learned." Rebecca nodded, her throat tightening as gratitude swelled within her. "Safe travels, ma'am." Victoria smiled. "You too." With that, she stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, where the cool airport air greeted her. Rebecca watched her disappear into the terminal, with a feeling she hadn't expected, a quiet sense of peace. The flow of passengers slowed as the last few people exited. Emma joined Rebecca at the front, her eyes twinkling with pride. "You handled that well," Emma said. Rebecca exhaled, a faint but real smile forming. "Thanks. I wasn't sure I could." Emma shrugged playfully. "You did more than that. You made it right." Rebecca's smile widened just a bit. "It's not over yet. Making it right isn't a one-time thing." Emma patted her on the shoulder. "True. But you took the first step, and that's more than some people ever do." Victoria walked through the bustling terminal, her steps steady but unhurried. She glanced at the departure boards, taking a moment to center herself amid the chaos of the airport. People streamed past her, families heading toward security, couples reuniting at the gates, and solo travelers lost in their own worlds. She stopped near a window overlooking the runway and watched as planes taxied across the tarmac. Her reflection stared back at her, calm and thoughtful. This journey wasn't just about the distance between Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. It was about the unseen distances people traveled within themselves, the quiet leaps of growth, the hard but necessary reckonings. A small vibration in her bag interrupted her thoughts. She reached for her phone and saw a notification, an email from a nonprofit organization she'd partnered with for years. They were reaching out to thank her for her latest speech on social justice and to invite her to speak at another event. Victoria smiled as she read the message, a renewed sense of purpose filling her heart. No matter where she went, the work was never finished, but that was the beauty of it. Every step mattered, every voice counted, and every moment was an opportunity to show the world what grace looked like in action. Back on the plane, Rebecca completed her post-flight checklist with Emma, moving through the cabin as they collected leftover service items. But her thoughts kept drifting to Victoria's words. She paused at seat 2A, running her hand lightly over the armrest as if trying to absorb the lesson that had unfolded there. She thought of all the flights she'd worked over the years, all the passengers she'd served without ever really seeing them as individuals with their own stories. This flight had changed that. Rebecca walked back to the front of the plane, glancing at Emma, who was wiping down the drink station. "Do you think people really change?" Rebecca asked quietly. Emma looked up, surprised by the question. "I think so," she replied after a moment. "But it depends on whether they're willing to face themselves." Rebecca nodded slowly. "I think I'm ready to do that." Emma smiled warmly. "Then you've already started." Outside, Victoria walked toward the escalators leading to baggage claim. As she descended, she noticed a family reuniting at the bottom, a mother hugging her teenage son tightly, as if she hadn't seen him in years. Victoria's smile grew. She loved watching people in these small, everyday moments of connection. As she exited the terminal, the cool evening air brushed against her skin, reminding her that she was alive, present, and moving forward. She took a deep breath and flagged down a taxi, sliding into the back seat with the same quiet grace she carried everywhere. "Where to, ma'am?" the driver asked. Victoria gave the address of her hotel and leaned back in the seat as the car pulled away from the curb. The city's lights reflected in the windows, flickering like stars, and in the quiet hum of the drive, Victoria thought of Rebecca, not with frustration or judgment, but with hope. She had seen a glimpse of who Rebecca could be, and that glimpse was enough to remind her why she did what she did. Back at the airport, Rebecca and Emma stood at the door of the plane, waving goodbye to the cleaning crew as they finished their work. As Rebecca watched the last cart roll away, she took a deep breath. Today had started as just another flight, but now it felt like the beginning of something much bigger. Rebecca smiled to herself, a small but meaningful expression of quiet determination. "Here's to new beginnings," she whispered. And as the airport settled into its usual rhythm, the memory of that flight, its lessons, its challenges, and its quiet acts of grace remained. Like the afterglow of a sunset that lingers long after the sun has set, Victoria James sat in her hotel room, the soft glow of the bedside lamp illuminating her notebook. She had always written reflections at the end of significant days, small moments of clarity, lessons she wanted to hold on to. Today had been one of those days. Her pen hovered above the paper before she began writing. Change doesn't always come from grand speeches or major decisions. Sometimes it's the quiet moments, the questions that make us pause, the mistakes that make us grow. Today reminded me of that. She paused, thinking of Rebecca Collins. The flight attendant's initial judgment had stung, but what mattered most was what happened afterward. Rebecca had owned her mistake, something many people struggled to do. That was the kind of shift Victoria had spent her career hoping to inspire, not through force, but through example. The next morning, Victoria woke early to an email notification. She rubbed her eyes and opened it, expecting a standard work-related message. Instead, she saw a familiar name in the subject line: Rebecca Collins. The message was brief, but heartfelt. "Dear Ms. James, I wanted to thank you once more for your grace and understanding. Yesterday wasn't just a lesson for me, it was a turning point. I've always prided myself on professionalism, but I realize now that true professionalism isn't about perfection. It's about humility, empathy, and respect. I hope to take this lesson with me into every flight, every interaction. With gratitude, Rebecca Collins." Victoria's lips curled into a small smile. She set the phone down and looked out the window at the bustling city below. People moved like dots along the streets, each with their own stories, their own struggles. Rebecca's story wasn't over, and neither was her own. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Rebecca was starting her morning shift, but something felt different. She moved through the pre-flight preparations with quiet efficiency, but her heart felt lighter. She noticed things she hadn't paid attention to before: the nervous smile of a first-time traveler, the tired eyes of a mother balancing a baby and a diaper bag. Emma caught up with her as they checked the drink station. "How are you holding up?" Emma asked. Rebecca smiled. "Better. I got an email back from Ms. James this morning." Emma raised her eyebrows. "Really? What did she say?" "She thanked me for reflecting and reminded me that growth isn't about one moment, but all the moments that come after." Emma nodded approvingly. "She sounds incredible." "She is," Rebecca said quietly. She didn't have to respond, but she did. And that response, it felt like she wasn't just letting it go. She was giving me permission to be better. News of the incident on the previous flight began to spread, though not in the scandalous way Rebecca had feared. Instead, passengers who had witnessed it started sharing their stories online, not as complaints, but as praise. A social media post from one passenger read, "Today, I watched an extraordinary woman handle a difficult situation with grace and strength. She didn't argue or make a scene, she taught a lesson without saying much at all. I hope I can carry that same calm into my own life." Another passenger, the young man in the hoodie, posted a photo of his notebook where he'd written Victoria's words: "Remember who you are, and you'll be stronger than you think." The post gained traction, with hundreds of comments reflecting on times when people had either judged or been judged, and the power of humility and kindness in those moments. Rebecca noticed the story spreading, but resisted the urge to read every post. Instead, she stayed focused on her work, determined to make meaningful changes in her daily life, rather than dwelling on what others were saying. In a Washington, D.C. office building, a CEO who had been on the same flight sat at his desk, staring at his notes. He had written a simple phrase during the flight: "Leadership starts with respect." He tapped his pen against the desk and then picked up the phone to call his executive team. "Let's schedule a meeting for next week," he said. "I want to talk about how we can create a more inclusive culture. There's a lot we've done right, but I think we can do more." His assistant blinked in surprise. "Of course, sir. What brought this on?" He smiled faintly. A quiet reminder from someone who lives what she believes. Victoria stepped into the auditorium later that afternoon for the keynote speech she'd been invited to give. The event was a conference for young leaders and social justice advocates. As she approached the podium, the room quieted in anticipation. She began with her usual introduction, but then her tone softened. "Yesterday, I was reminded of something I want to share with you today," she said, her voice steady but warm. "We often think change happens through large movements or big moments, but sometimes change begins with one conversation, one apology, or one simple act of reflection." She paused, letting the words settle. True resilience isn't just about standing tall in the face of adversity. It's about choosing how you respond when you're tested. And true kindness is stronger than any force you'll ever encounter. The room was silent, but the energy was palpable, an undercurrent of understanding and inspiration. Back at the airport, Rebecca finished another flight with her team and returned to the break room. She sat at one of the tables, sipping from a water bottle and staring out the window as planes took off into the sky. She pulled out a notepad and began writing. "To the passenger in seat 2A, you reminded me that everyone carries a story we can't see at first glance. You reminded me that respect isn't earned by outward appearances, but by recognizing the dignity we all carry within us. Thank you for your patience, your strength, and your example. You've given me more than a lesson, you've given me a new way to see the world." She didn't plan to send the note, but she kept it in her bag as a reminder to herself, more than anyone else. In another part of the country, the ripples of that flight continued. People who had seen the story online shared their own experiences of being judged or making assumptions. A quiet wave of self-reflection had begun, not a viral sensation, but a meaningful conversation that reached beyond a single flight. Victoria's words had traveled farther than she'd ever know. Rebecca knew she couldn't change her past actions, but she could change everything moving forward. And as she stood to begin another shift, she felt something new in her heart, a sense of peace that comes when you choose to live better than you did before. That evening, as the city lights blinked to life, Victoria sat by her hotel window, watching the world below. The phone buzzed with a message from her assistant, confirming another speaking engagement. She placed the phone down and gazed at the reflection of the world outside. Mistakes were inevitable, but how people corrected them, that was what defined their character. She closed her eyes briefly, resting in the knowledge that small acts of grace could ripple outward and create a world where empathy could rise above judgment. The morning sky over Washington, D.C. was painted with soft hues of gold and lavender as the city slowly came to life. Victoria James took one last look at the view from her hotel room window before zipping her suitcase closed. Today, she would head home, but the events of the past few days stayed with her, a quiet reminder that change often began in places you didn't expect. She made her way to the lobby, where her car service waited. The doorman greeted her with a polite nod as she stepped outside into the crisp morning air. As the car pulled away, Victoria allowed herself to reflect on the journey, one that had started with a flight, but ended with something much more profound. At the airport, Rebecca Collins was already busy preparing for her next flight. The boarding gates buzzed with travelers pulling their luggage and sipping coffee. Rebecca's uniform was neatly pressed, her hair tied back in a sleek ponytail, but there was something else about her that was different now, a sense of calm, grounded in humility. Emma appeared beside her, carrying a clipboard. "Ready for another day?" Rebecca smiled. "Yeah, I think I am." Emma studied her face for a moment and then nodded approvingly. "Good. You're not just ready. You're ready in a whole new way." Rebecca laughed softly, a genuine sound that felt like a fresh start. "It's strange. Yesterday was one of the hardest days I've had on the job, but I think it was also the most important." Emma handed Rebecca a stack of pre-flight papers. "Funny how that works." Rebecca nodded. "Yeah, funny and humbling." Elsewhere in the terminal, Victoria made her way toward the security line, her carry-on in hand. As she passed the rows of departure gates, she noticed a group of school children chattering excitedly, their matching T-shirts proclaiming a class trip to the nation's capital. Victoria smiled at their enthusiasm. It reminded her of when she was a young girl, filled with dreams of making a difference in the world. A familiar voice broke through her thoughts. "Ms. James?" Victoria turned to see a young man approaching the same passenger who had worn the hoodie on her flight. Today he looked more polished, wearing a button-down shirt and carrying a briefcase. "Hello," Victoria greeted warmly. The young man hesitated before speaking. I wasn't expecting to run into you again, but I'm glad I did." Victoria tilted her head, intrigued. "Why's that?" He smiled shyly. "I wanted to thank you properly. What you said to me on that flight, it stuck with me. I've thought about it a lot, about how I want to carry myself when things get hard. I even wrote it down, 'Remember who you are, and you'll be stronger than you think.'" Victoria's heart warmed. "I'm glad it resonated with you." "It did," he said earnestly. "I've already faced a few situations where I could have let my frustration get the better of me. But I didn't, and that's because of you." Victoria reached out and gently placed a hand on his arm. "You've had that strength all along. I just reminded you it was there." The young man nodded, his eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you again." "Safe travels." "And to you," Victoria replied with a smile as he walked away. Rebecca stood near the boarding gate, greeting passengers as they filed in. She noticed a mother juggling a baby and a toddler who kept pulling at her arm. Without hesitation, Rebecca stepped forward. "Let me help you with that," Rebecca offered, holding out her hand for the stroller the mother was struggling with. The mother looked relieved. "Oh, thank you so much." Rebecca smiled warmly as she secured the stroller and helped the little boy find his seat. "No problem at all. Take a deep breath, you're doing great." The mother exhaled and gave Rebecca a grateful smile. "Not everyone's so kind. This means a lot." Rebecca nodded, a quiet understanding in her eyes. Kindness goes a long way. Victoria's flight boarded quickly, and she settled into her seat by the window, pulling out her notebook. She flipped to a blank page and began to write. "The world doesn't change all at once. It changes when one person chooses kindness over judgment, when one mistake becomes a lesson, and when one conversation opens someone's heart to see things differently." She paused, tapping her pen against the edge of the notebook. Rebecca's face flashed in her mind, not the face of someone who had failed, but the face of someone who was willing to grow. By the time Rebecca's flight reached cruising altitude, she found herself pausing near the galley, staring out at the expanse of clouds stretching as far as the eye could see. She thought of Victoria and the way she had carried herself with grace, patience, and strength that didn't need to be loud to be powerful. Emma passed by with a tray of drinks and smiled. "You're daydreaming," she teased. Rebecca laughed. "Just reflecting." Emma grinned. "Good. I think it suits you." Rebecca watched Emma walk away, then whispered to herself, "One step at a time." That afternoon, Victoria's plane touched down in her home city. As she walked through the familiar terminal, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The story of that flight wasn't about what had gone wrong. It was about what had gone right after the wrongs had been acknowledged. When she reached the taxi stand, she pulled out her phone and drafted a brief email to one of her advocacy teams. "Let's schedule another community outreach event. There's so much work to be done, and I've been reminded that even small moments can spark big changes." She hit send and smiled, the sound of the city filling her ears as she stepped into a cab. At the end of her shift, Rebecca returned home to her small apartment and pulled out the note she'd written the night before. She read it once more. "To the passenger in seat 2A, you reminded me that everyone carries a story we can't see at first glance. You reminded me that respect isn't earned by outward appearances, but by recognizing the dignity we all carry within us." Rebecca smiled softly. She didn't need to send it. It was a promise she'd already made to herself. She tucked the note into the corner of her mirror and whispered, "Thank you." Across the city, people who had read about Victoria's story continued to share it, each of them reminded of their own moments of growth, their own second chances. It wasn't a grand viral sensation, but it didn't need to be. It was a quiet reminder that grace, respect, and perseverance didn't just belong to the headlines, they belonged to the everyday moments of our lives. As the stars began to shine over the city, Victoria and Rebecca both rested two women from different worlds, connected by one flight and a shared belief in the power of kindness. And as the world moved forward, so did they reminded that while mistakes could shape the past, it was what you did next that defined who you truly were. Life is filled with unexpected moments that challenge us to reflect, grow, and become better versions of ourselves. This story reminds us that kindness, humility, and second chances have the power to create lasting change, not just in our lives, but in the lives of those around us. Mistakes don't define us. It's how we choose to correct them that truly matters. If you found inspiration in Victoria and Rebecca's journey and believe in the power of resilience and compassion, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Join us for more thought-provoking stories that uplift, inspire, and remind us of the importance of grace, perseverance, and hope. Thank you for being part of this journey. Remember, small acts of kindness can spark big changes. Don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your own stories of growth and resilience. Subscribe today for more stories that will stay with you long after the final chapter. Thank you, and see you next time.